I love that more folks are joining us. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. We're going to have an incredible conversation. Oh, I see Abraham is already here with us. If you could come up to the stage, Abraham, we would love to have you here with us. And I'm looking at the list of attendees. I see familiar names. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really such a pleasure to have this conversation. We're going to give folks a couple more seconds. You know what, Jacinta? While we wait for folks to, oh, we have Abraham.
Sorry
Yes.
about that.
No
Can you
worries.
guys hear me? Can you guys see me?
Yes.
Okay. It's not important if you could see me, but hearing me, I think
It
is.
is. Both of them are important.
We'll see.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. We are all sort of getting used to the new reality here on Happen, the virtual world. So don't even worry.
Absolutely. Thank you again for the invite.
Great, 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 great. Actually, I'm gonna get us started while the rest of our panel makes it to the stage. I know we have folks already in the room, and I want to honor people's times. So my name is Jonathan J. Green, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Marguerite Casey Foundation. The Marguerite Casey Foundation is a national private grant-making organization focused on supporting local leaders and organizations in building power across the country. We believe that an economy and a democracy that represents the dreams, the ambitions, the contributions of people who have long been excluded from it is possible. And the architects of those new institutions are our local leaders and organizers. So it is our job to invest in them. Right before my work at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, I had the honor of serving as the National Director of Latinx Outreach for Senator Warren's presidential campaign. And right before that, I had the honor of serving as the founding executive director of the Black Network, which is a national network organizing Black undocumented folks across the country and building power. So this conversation that we're gonna have today around the criminalization of immigrants is so personal and close to my heart. And I am so incredibly honored that I have such an incredible panel, both here and also on their way, because we have more folks who are coming. But I want to just set this the scene of the conversation. While folks make it, this conversation is around the criminalization of immigrants, and as we're witnessing state-sponsored violence across the world, both in Palestine and Colombia and everywhere else in this world, I can't help but to just like really take in the moment that we're living through and the way in which our issues are interconnected both domestically and abroad. And particularly, I think as an activist, at times it feels like everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about the criminalization of immigrants, but we want to make some space to really break down these terms and talk about what do we mean when we say these concepts, and also explain okay, so what's the history, how does it manifest itself, and what we can do to interrupt it in the future. So this conversation is around really how do we, as a movement, do a better job of making sure that our work and our solutions are as intersectional as the problems that our communities are fighting and the people who are most impacted at the center. So that's really what this conversation is about. I want to turn it over to our panel. I want to ask each panelist to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask for a quick 30-second intro. And if you could answer the question, what is on your heart as we're entering this conversation, that would be great. So I'm going to start with you, Jacinta. Quick 30 seconds intro, and then what is on your heart.
Awesome. Thank you so much for setting up the conversation, Jonathan. It's great to be here. It's great to see you again, Abraham. It's been a minute. So my name is Jacinta Gonzalez. I am the senior campaign organizer with Mi Gente. So actually do a lot of the crimmigration work, the criminalization work that Mi Gente has been working on, get the opportunity to organize on that front. I think what's on my heart right now is a moment. We're actually in a really, really, really pivotal moment. Like literally as we're talking, the Department of Homeland Security is figuring out how to draft their priorities, right, in terms of who they want to be targeting for deportation, how they're going to be using that power. And so I actually think that now more than ever, it's important to be having these conversations, because this is actually the basis for which we figure out how we continue to fight. So that's kind of on my heart. I feel like the urgency of the moment is with me as we're entering this convo.
That is perfect. Thank you so much, Jacinta. And welcome, Gresa. We have Gresa Martinez Rosas, Director from United We Dream, join us on our panel. So happy to have you. We are just getting started. The question that I've been asking panelists is to introduce themselves and to quickly tell us what is on your heart. I'm going to go to Abraham first to give you a second, Gresa, and then you go next.
Thank you again. So happy to be sharing space with everyone. Who am I? What am I doing? I'm the Deputy Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And I've been in this work not too long. It's been since about 2011. And I think what is like in my heart as we are sort of discussing is just, shout out to my cousins that I had two that got deported and one just got out. So I'm really happy about the one that came home. I don't think he's gonna be able to make it, but I feel good that at least some of our family is reunited right now.
Thank you, Abraham. Gresa?
Hola, buenas tardes, or good morning, good afternoon. My name is Gresa Martinez Rosas. I use she, her, ella pronouns. My friends and homies call me G. And I apologize for my tech issues. I want to say that I'm coming in with a lot of gratitude and a lot of like what this actually means, like the topic of our conversation means in my life. I am calling you from Actopan, Hidalgo, Mexico, which is where my ancestors and my mom and my dad came from. It's my first time in Mexico in the last 25 years. And just yesterday, I got to reunite with my dad that was deported more than 15 years ago. And so in both the shifts in which, or the changes that life has brought to us, the separation and what that has meant for our lives, and also the joy of being to what Abraham was talking about, of being reunited, I think is very real in my body today. And so I have the pleasure and the honor to represent United We Dream and United We Dream Action. We're the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network working at the intersection of immigrant justice, racial justice, and gender justice. And I'm really proud to be on this panel with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for sharing and for your work and your leadership in this space, in this moment. I see that we have Jennifer Chacon in the audience. If the tech folks could help us get Jennifer from the audience to the panel, that would be fantastic. But while we do that, I want to get started with our questions. So, like I mentioned at the top of this conversation, that while conversations about the criminalization of immigrants in this country at times may feel mainstream, I feel like not everyone always understands the underpinning of the machinery that is in place that both President Obama and Trump used and built on to deport immigrants en masse. So I would love if our panelists could give us, just a little bit more context of like what do you see are the main markers of this machine, and like the main moments that you think are worth lifting up as we're having a conversation about both the past but also the future? And I'll open it up to whoever would love to pitch in. I know all three of you are experts in this conversation, so I'm going to start with Jacinta. Jacinta, can you get us started?
Sure. I mean, I think when I think about the criminalization of immigrants, I would think of three particular buckets or things that are important to uplift. I think the first is the ways in which for decades now, the criminal legal system has been connected or had consequences for the immigration and deportation system, right? And so I think particularly about the 90s, right? When folks like Bill Clinton were trying to prove that Democrats could also be tough on crime and pass the 94 crime bill, but also pass the 96 immigration laws. And think about all of the ways in which that kind of expanded the categories under which folks could be put in deportation proceedings, stripped of any sort of protection that they would have of any sort of legal status, and really intensified the role that having any sort of contact with the policing system would have on your life, right? Whether that meant that you would be banned from public housing, or whether that meant if 3 strikes, then that would mean you would be locked up for longer, or whether or not that meant that that conviction was going to mean that you would be deported. But then I also think of another category, which is really after 9/11 and the creation of DHS, where it was sort of decided that it's not only that we need a deportation system, we actually need a deportation police force, right? And that's really in the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. And through that process of both building up Border Patrol, building up ICE, building up TSA, that the Department of Homeland Security built up the biggest police force in the United States, with the excuse of protecting the homeland, with the excuse of deporting people. But what we saw under Trump is that very quickly that policing system gets used against everyone, right? And that same policing system is also being used to test new ways of surveillance, which is also just like the new way of expanding policing. And then the third bucket I would say in terms of criminalization that's important is the way all of these white supremacist laws for a while now have been used to criminalize the act of migration. Right. So I think about in the 1920s and 30s, when senators were literally in, the halls of Congress creating laws to take care of the Mexican problem, right? That actually made it a crime to enter the United States legally or to enter after you were deported. And, folks might be surprised to know that almost half of federal prosecutions, right, criminal prosecutions, folks that are sent to the Bureau of Prisons, is for immigration related offenses, right? For illegal entry, for illegal reentry. This was used as the basis of a lot of the kids that were separated from their parents under the Trump administration. But, that Secretary Mayorkas has been saying we should do more of, right? He's actually promoting the prosecution of folks for reentry after they've been deported. So to me, we really have to think about both the system of policing for deportation, the ways the policing and criminal legal system are used to impact deportation and kind of expand that, but then also the criminalization of the act of migration itself, as a further punishment, not just deporting people.
Thank you. What a brilliant way to break it down, and also thank you for that offering of the different categories, because I think it oftentimes feels like such a sprawling system that it's hard for people to understand where things are coming from. So that was really helpful, Jacinta. Abraham and Grace, is there anything you would add to just how we need to contextualize this conversation and our understanding about the criminalization of immigrants?
Yeah, I think definitely plus to with the clear way that Jacinta just laid out the 3 pillars. I'll say that the piece that we have really been investigating and wanting to really focus our analysis at United We Dream is the one of profit. At the end of the day, the fact that criminalization and the detention centers and enforcement, the fact that Black and brown people have been criminalized and detained is because of what we know to be racial capitalism. The idea that Black and brown bodies, that Mexican day laborers, that people my father, my mother, their only service was to be able to create capital for this country, and therefore anything else that they would want to achieve would be criminalized. And I think that part of the idea of the mass industrial complex of detention and deportation is one grounded by corporations that are making money every single day, that are lobbying every single day for ICE and CBP to not heed our demands for defunding ICE and CBP and the agencies, but rather want to see their contracts explode and want to continue to see, the children being brought in and the migrants coming in being as a form of profit for them. And so I think that when we think about that, I think about the intersection of gender, and when we see that the majority of the women that or the people that have been incarcerated, and similar to in Black communities and homes, that it's like men in the family nucleus that are being detained and deported and have been, you know, separated from their families, and therefore have like caused a catastrophic event on families. And so I guess when I think about this, and I think about like the long arc of our work, as my coach talks to me about, I think about the arc that includes like Carmelita Torres, which was like a young woman that would like go and hundreds of years ago, that would like come into the U.S. from Mexico to be able to, you know, profit or like be able to cultivate the farm worker land, etc. And she was subjected, like many other Mexicans, to being bathed in these assets before they came in to be able to put our labor into this country, and criminalized in that way. And she stood up one day and said that it was enough, and then that caused like the bath riots all across the southern border. And so when I think about the pillars that Jacinta talked about as pillars of profit for corporations, and in particular white supremacy, I also think about the courage and the history that we embody, like Abraham, Jacinta, myself, you, Jonathan, and the many people that are listening to us today, that are really talking about a rebellion of something that is really about our human dignity and about women really being able to stand up. And so, which is why I'm really glad to be in this conversation with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there's so much of that that deeply resonates, but especially around your contribution of really making sure we're uplifting racial capitalism in this conversation. I think something I mentioned at the top of the call is how intersectional these threats are, like how connected, I actually should use that instead of intersectional, but like how connected all these systems are, and like the imperative of us to be able to draw the connections between profit and the criminalization and sort of like the broader project of white supremacy, right? And like the ways in which it manifests, but also I think what you said, Grace, around like really uplifting the courage and the courage and the joy and the rebellion, as you called it, of our people, right? Like it's not just that awful things are happening to us without us fighting back. And I think that's what, in a big part, this is what the conversation is about. Abraham, is there anything you want to add to this?
No, well, I mean, I was going to add a little something to 3 of Jacinta's pillars, and then the last one about profit. So the 90s is extremely important for a lot of people to understand, particularly to understand that here in urban America, where Black and brown people were actually at, right? We were going through a lot: deindustrialization, social services were being cut, education, if you want to call it that. And Congress got together and decided to essentially go to war on our communities, right? And it's known as the war on drugs. And in the war on drugs came the 1996 legislation. And I know you were saying earlier, you were like, people might not understand what that means. So I'll just count the ways in which that legislation is still the law of the land right now. Mandatory detention and deportation, expansion of crimes, right? Retroactivity, meaning that they went back to the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s, right? And so those things that Jacinta said about how the immigration legislation wrapped itself around the carceral state in the United States, right here, is very, very important. And we're still dealing with that today. The numbers came out for 2019 deportation numbers. 76% of Black people getting deported is because of contact with the police. In the Caribbean, it's 86%. Poor Jamaica, 93% of people get deported to Jamaica because of contact with the criminal system. And the same goes with our Central American brothers and sisters. Even though it's more than half, right, by the 50th percentile, still, that's hundreds of thousands of people getting deported back to Mexico because of contact with the local police. So the 90s is important because they essentially called it war. And then we've got what Jacinta said was a second pillar, the war on terror, right? And that's an escalation because ICE and DHS came through, in which they were like, we're going to give billions and billions of dollars to escalate this war we've already had on Black and brown people, right? The millions of dollars billions of dollars at this point, right? And then the third thing is sort of this enforcement of migration, which is really important because the US has always had that for Black and brown people. I mean, Jacinta said something about the 1920s. I think about the northern migration that Black Americans went from the South to the North, escaping what people escape now in other countries: Jim Crow laws, persecution, discrimination, or whatever have you. So I think all of that is still it's still there. And then G, I'm gonna call you that because I like that, with profit, and you're totally right. Right? Even the term essential workers, right? Why is it that Black and brown people have to essentially, our dignity is wrapped around our bodies, right? Whether it's labor or whether we're in a cage. And that becomes a problem. And so I think moving forward, I like to look at this as a war that has been escalated. So when we see CBP funding, ICE funding, right? I think that's a wonky way of just saying that they're investing, right, with guns and weapons and not investing in any type of negotiation in good faith with our communities. So there's a saying, I think, out there, I think it comes from Brazil, that says, after the saliva, there's gunpowder. And I think what this administration, this government has shown, right, is that they're not really trying to have a conversation with us if you're still going to increase the police or the soldiers or whatever you want to call it. And so there is no de-escalation of the war that I see right now. So I wanted to just add a little bit on 4 of those great pillars.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you for that great framing around war on our people, and being able to make that connection through time, but also just being clear-eyed about what's happening, what's not happening. What's not happening is de-escalation. What is happening is an escalation on that war. So thank you, Abraham. I want to move us to the next question for a second. And I know all of us have feelings around this, but I'm gonna do my best. But earlier in the previous presidential administration, there was a global outrage over the human rights violations at the US-Mexico border, where children were separated from their parents before being detained. The outrage has subsided, but the atrocities continue. How should we re-examine our border and immigration enforcement policies? What changes to DHS and CBP and ICE are needed? And what, more importantly, this is my take on this, what is your and your community's vision for what enforcement looks like in this country? I want to start, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to start with you, Abraham. We're both on mute.
Yeah, I'm off mute. I'm the worst person to ask this question because I feel like we've got Jacinta and G on here, but I think I'm the great person to kick it off because then I can just shut up after. So the border, I mean, I think there's a reframing. I think that since I've been able to go down and as close to the border as I can, it's a war zone down there. But I think it's opened up a lot of things that I think that the rest of the country, particularly those of us up north, right, don't really see that this is an indigenous community, right? And so I think to just sort of say that, oh yeah, well here it's just non-citizens versus citizens, that I think is too reductionist in a real way. And I really do think that this is a situation around land and people that has not been worked out before the Treaty of Guadalupe, right? Even to the 1792 Citizenship Act in this country that basically said, if Black people can't be citizens and indigenous people can't be citizens, this same population is disproportionate in our prison systems right now, right? These two populations are just disproportionate around having a livelihood and a dignity. So when I think about the border, I look at it as okay, this is a land and people issue. And I think those that are from these communities have the best way to understand about reconciliation, right? and some restitution that needs to be given. And one way for reconciliation that I'm always for, it's not just the Mexico US border. I come from a border conflict with Ethiopia and Eritrea, right? It's just really about finding ways to open it up, right? Finding ways for people to have freedom of movement.
Yeah.
And that's a human right.
Thank you, Abraham. I am so excited that we have our last panelist join us. I'm so sorry. I know we're all having technical issues, so do not worry, but we're so happy to have you. Can you just quickly introduce yourself and tell us what's on your heart?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jennifer Chacon. I am a professor at UCLA at the law school. I have never used Hop-In before, and I will never use it again. I hope they're not a sponsor of this event. But I just wanted to say I've been struggling to get in, but while I've been doing that, I've also been listening to all of you, and I put that up at the chat, but I just at some point typed in there, this panel is fire and does not need me. And that's how I feel. I feel like you all have already beautifully sort of laid out the major themes that I think are sort of undergirding the criminalization of migration in terms of racial capitalism, in terms of these intertwined systems of oppression, in terms of kind of the legacies of colonialism. And so all of those themes are already on the table. And I think Abraham in particular has sort of highlighted the role of anti-Blackness in these sort of intertwined systems as well. And so I think, what is there left to say? I want to turn it back to you, Jonathan, and just say, I just feel like this has been an amazing and really enlightening conversation for me, and that I've already learned from it, even as I have struggled through the technical difficulties. So thank you for letting me come and join.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here. We're so excited that we get to benefit also from your contribution. So I want to just quickly get us back on the last question around the border. So I'm just going to repeat the question and then turn it over to you, Jacinta. How should we re-examine our border and immigration policies? What changes to DHS, CBP, and ICE are needed, and what is your and your community's vision for what enforcement looks like in the state?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me at its core, I think that the silver lining about having the Trump administration is that a lot of folks had to open their eyes to the truth of what a lot of these systems were about. And I think Trump made it painfully clear that the point of the child separation was the cruelty. He actually wanted to make it so cruel, so painful, that this would serve as a deterrence for folks migrating. And so the militarization Abraham is talking about at the border, the enforcement, the criminalization practices that have happened for a while have always been under this framework that if you make it so hard to cross the border, if you make it that it's a life or death issue, if you make it so painful and built on so much suffering, that maybe people won't migrate anymore. Turns out that's wrong, and you just spend billions of dollars on a whole system that's actually making humanize people, and that the cruelty is the point of the system. And so the thing that I think is just important for us to take away about what happened at the border with child separation is that, we did see incredible mobilizations, we saw incredible organizing, asking, where are the kids? But we forgot to ask the question, where are the parents? And the parents were in federal court being prosecuted for 1325 illegal entry or 1326 illegal reentry. And so what happened was there was a huge scandal about putting kids in cages, but we didn't actually get to the fundamental issue of a whole machinery that was made to federally prosecute people, put them in prison, then put them in detention centers, and then deport them. And so that's why now we have, again, Secretary Mayorkas saying we should be prosecuting more people about this. And when just a couple of weeks ago, someone from UCLA asked him, do you know the racist history of these laws? Do you know why they were actually created? He was like, oh no, I had no idea, right? Because again, there hasn't been a real challenge to the underlying system and this idea that you should have deterrence at the border as a way of dealing with migration. And so I think fundamentally what we have to do is make sure that, not only the future, but that this administration understands that a deterrence first approach is unacceptable, and that we actually have to be creating a system that will allow people to ask for asylum without relying on detention. Right? This idea that, right now they're allowing minor children to enter, but anyone who isn't a kid, actually, because of Title 42, which is based on bogus science, is not a real thing, is automatically expelled. And that's why you've had dozens and dozens of flights to Haiti. That's why folks from Central America can't even get into the country. And that's why you have over 300,000, deportations and expulsions under this administration, right? That's still a huge problem. And so for us, like, it's important for us to both be able to, like, have the outcry about the worst of the worst. I love kids, like, people who know me know I go gaga about children, but like it is actually about a fundamental like shift in how we're asking the question, because if not, allowing them to do is like make it a little bit better at the top for folks that are the most vulnerable. But then if you're a single dude and you're 22, turns out it's okay for them to use the full militarized border against you, whether that's you detaining you, deporting you, using any sort of surveillance against you. And so I think there just has to be this different question around like, how are we actually investing in, a way of thinking about things that actually create systems that don't rely on enforcement and that don't let deterrence be the primary motivator.
Period. Yes. Just so brilliant. Yes, absolutely. On that note, I actually want to turn it to Graysa, because I know that the work that Category has been doing has been around trying to push for action. So I want to turn the same question around the border, ICBP. But particularly, I would love, Graysa, if you could just talk a little bit about like, what should people who are watching this conversation do? Like, what are the moments and the ways for them to get involved to really interrupt this dynamic?
So I guess for the ultimate vision for the members of United We Dream isn't the abolishment of the DHS and ICE and CBP as it exists. I think that in the same tradition and following the leadership of Black thought leaders, when we call for the abolishment of police, call for the ICE and CBP to have the same fate, and at the same time take responsibility for building out what the solution that we want for our world and for the vision, which is a place that welcomes immigrants. Immigration is a global phenomenon. As Jacinta has been saying, it has been and it will be, and it is part of being a human. People move. People are able to they're able to like have dreams that take them beyond the starting place where they were born. And so, and then in a lot of ways, this is also where the intersections of issues like climate change and what we were talking about, like corporate power, is really coming to a bend, which is like, there's so much things that are moving people, not only from like Latin America or South America, but this is a global phenomenon. Just last month, we were in a conversation with undocumented young people that have found a home in Ireland, that are coming from the continent of Africa and are really wanting to like build up their movement of immigrant young people within that state, and are really coming in with like the vision of like saying that they are undocumented and unafraid wherever it is that they stand. And so part of the conflict that we are seeing, or part of the challenge that we're seeing right now in Palestine and in Israel, it's a conflict about borders. It's a conflict about militarization, and it's an opportunity for us to be able to see what is like if there is no intervention of directly impacted people that have a forward-facing vision about what does it mean to belong, what does it mean to be at home, what does it mean, and who gets to decide where you get to stay. I think it's sort of the future that we have seen over and over and over again repeat itself. And so, which is why at United We Dream, we've set up for ourselves our platform, which is the Free to Stay, Free to Move platform. And so for folks that are watching us today, I'll say go and follow the Movement for Black Lives and their call for abolition. If you want to defund ICE, CBP, and the police, ensure that your member of Congress knows that they need to advance and pass the BREATHE Act, that we need to undo the 1996 laws. If you want to support, thinkers like the folks on this call, donate to the organizations that Jacinta and Abraham and other folks on this call are being part of, to be able to advance our vision moving forward. I think that the third thing, which is important to what Jacinta was talking about, is it's going to be important for us to both be really honest with ourselves have grace of transformation with ourselves and interrogate the information that is really we're all swimming around, that people that have committed quote unquote crimes should be punished, that the way to be able to do that is by detention, pain, and incarceration, and that it shows up in small ways in our day-to-day lives and in huge ways in policy. And so as all of us are navigating our lives and you're in the right place if you're in this conversation, ensuring that you continue to be a student. And so I am a big fan of Professor Chacon. I was like so excited to be able to join this call because your writing has been really instrumental for me and for, I know, my team to be able to formulate or put words into like the thoughts and the feelings that we have sort of navigated for so long. And so I invite people to read Professor Chacon's work as well. So those are some of the actionable things, but at the end of the day, there is what I call the discipline of hope, that yes, the system is difficult, the system is punishing, the system kills, and yet someone like my dad that spent time in detention and was then deported back to Mexico is someone that now is telling me the story of his survival, and that though he should not have had to be so resilient, that like the history of our ancestors runs through his veins, and he is still here, and I get to hug him. So I feel really proud and honored to be in a witness to that transformation that is happening across the country, and I will hold on to this discipline of hope.
Thank you. Okay, so that is really beautiful. I know that we're running out of time, so I love that you gave us actionable steps. You gave us framing. You in some ways did my job, and I really appreciate you for it. As we're wrapping up, I actually would love to ask folks if they could give us like closing remarks. Particularly like if Jacinta and Abraham, and Professor Chacon, if there are other additional actionable steps you want to uplift in this conversation, if there are other like places that you think folks should spend more time researching, reading about. I know that this is a journey for a lot of folks. We'll love it if you could uplift that. So I'm going to start with you, Jacinta.
Sure. I mean, I would just say, like, I opened up talking about this particular moment that we're in. I think that there's been a huge surge of movement in the immigrant rights movement on several different fronts, trying to push for different ways of protecting our people. But I want to make sure that we're not also losing sight of what's happening within the Department of Homeland Security. For a long time, because of COVID, detention rates were actually going down, and they started going back up in the last couple of weeks. And the reason for that is because we know that folks have been organizing against deportations, organizing against ICE for a long time. And as a result, President Biden came in and tried to issue a moratorium on deportations. Because of court stuff, because of ICE stuff, that got watered down substantially. But really who watered it down was the secretary when he drafted the new guidelines for ICE agents in terms of how they should be conducting arrests and deportations right now. And, Abraham spoke brilliantly about some of the categories that came out of the 90s, right? The way the war on drugs was used to create these categories that would allow ICE agents to have more power to determine people's future and expand and mold the legal system to their will to be able to have more excuses to cause harm in communities. And so those are the same categories that now Secretary Mayorkas is using in his memos to ICE agents. He's saying anyone who has an aggravated felony, which doesn't have to be aggravated or a felony, right, to actually be used against people, that should be a basis for deporting people. If you're a recent arrival, that should be a basis. If it's national security, that should be a basis. We know how that's used. If they're any relationship to a gang, right, which means if you have a tattoo, that should be a basis. And so right now they are drafting what they will consider to be the permanent guidelines for ICE agents. This will be the basis for every arrest, every person who's in detention, every person who's having to go and fight their case in court or fight their case before ICE agents. And so this is the time to actually, like, I would say, I think that people have really, gotten more comfortable calling out policing, calling out the racism in our criminal legal system. Now is the time to actually put our organizing where our rhetoric is and actually fight back also against the Department of Homeland Security, fight back against Secretary Mayorkas, you know, when he's saying these kind of things, to actually demand a memo that would actually give people protection from the extra power that ICE agents have. We should be having protections from retaliation, protection from people who are calling out racist policing, protection for people who are organizing in their workplace. These are actually the instructions that ICE agents need to hear. They need to be given more wiggle room in terms of how they're criminalizing our people. They need to be given limits, right, in terms of their power so that we can fight more deportations. And so I think, like, as much as it's great that folks are pushing Congress to act, as much as it's great that folks are asking Biden to support immigration reform, we also cannot lose sight of the fact that the Department of Homeland Security right now is causing this much harm in our communities, and that has to be a target of our organizing. So I would just sort of leave that as an open invitation for folks that want to plug in. We just got out of doing a tactic called the Eyes on ICE, where folks were having truth and accountability forums, but we're going to continue to be thinking about actions and ways to be pressuring this administration. And, you know, would just like invite people to really plug into that, because it's not enough to just be asking Congress to pass a couple of bills, because they're going to leave so many of our people out. They already have huge carve outs. You know, like there's so much that's happening there that we really can't lose sight of the fact that they're drafting this memo in the next couple of weeks. So it's a really urgent time.
Thank you, Jacinta. Abraham?
What is there left after that? Thank you, Jacinta. What was the question, Jonathan? It was like what we could do. Is this the part where we're supposed to inspire the audience? Is this it? I don't know. He just left. Okay. Well, I mean, I think Jacinta brings up great, you know, like it's beyond legislation, even though the legislation that has been put forth is anti-Black, and just anytime there's criminal bars, just that should just be a spidey sense that says this is just going to increase, this is going to escalate the war, right? And then going to the DHS and ICE priorities, right? This is like, you know, the myth of Black criminality, right? This is like the long narrative, right? That Black and brown men that do not submit to the white supremacist narrative, it is going to be a problem. And so their solution is to lock up, disenfranchise, exclude socially, politically, economically, and then on a good day, kill us, really. And I want to just sort of say that as far as just moving forward is that I know having these conversations around anti-Blackness has been difficult for certain folks, right? And I just want to say that you know, easy streets don't make no riders. So it's just they don't call it a struggle for a reason. And then for the last 30 seconds, I know I had been talking about sort of framing a lot of what's going on in sort of this paradigm of war, and on that, you know, shout out to the Palestinians, which it's generous calling it a war. I think it's more or less a conflict, or I mean, not a conflict, a genocide, essentially, a total eviction. Some of it has a lot of resemblance to how the language that ICE has, right, over our communities, the undesirables, the folks that they don't want here anymore. And in another framing, you know, one can look at deportations of those with criminal convictions as an apparatus of social cleansing, right? And so with that, I mean, I just really want to say is like what people can do today, right, is understand the war that's going on in Palestine and support those folks, because I think when we're looking at DHS, ICE, the police budget has only increased and only continue to increase in this country, right? And who is that for?
Yeah, thank you, Abraham. Professor Chacon, you're on mute.
And the technical difficulties continue. So that seems like an apt way for me to close out. But I guess I wanted to circle back to the comments that other people have made and just highlight and emphasize some of the themes. So one theme that I think Jacinta's remarks make very clear is that we have developed a language and a vocabulary for talking about problems in the criminal legal system, right? We recognize that it's racially disproportionate. We recognize that it's overly punitive, and yet we default to it as Jacinta noted when it comes to deciding who the priorities are for removal, without questioning the fact that it is overly punitive and that it is racially disproportionate. So it seems like we need to take all the vocabulary and all of the language that we already have when we talk about the criminal legal system and use that when we think about what's happening around ICE and ICE priorities, and not just when we think about who's being targeted as a priority for removal, but also when we think about how we frame questions about who's deprioritized. So when we think about things like DACA or deferred action, or those are also places where we uniformly carve out people with criminal convictions, and it sort of heightens this dichotomy, which is sort of framed around a hugely problematic underlying system. So I think really making sure that we are sort of moving these conversations together in tandem rather than in two separate spheres, which I think everybody on this panel is already doing in their work. So sort of making that also plain to academics or to people who are organizing in one of the two spaces, I think is really helpful. And the other thing that I think this conversation makes clear is it's important to keep this conversation both international in its dimensions and grounded in history. So going back to Jacinta's earlier point about the fact that the Trump administration was going to be so cruel that people wouldn't come. Well, imagine what's driving people to come already, knowing what they're heading into, right? Knowing that they're going to be taking a journey that's fraught with incredible violence, knowing that it's going to be incredibly dangerous, knowing that it disrupts their lives, right? If they've already made the decision that that is necessary, the idea that U.S. immigration policy is going to be the deciding factor is really a bit naive and short-sighted. So I think we need to think about all of the factors that drive people to move or make it desirable for people to move, and think about how we, how we don't pretend that our enforcement system is going to be the cudgel that is going to shape every life decision that everybody makes. It's just not. And so when we have a conversation in that way, it really does increase the sort of the idea that you can be sufficiently cruel that this will stop people from moving, and that just it's never been right, and it's not right now. So clearly, something other than cruelty, other than guns, other than pulling children away from parents, other than having policies that encourage parents to send children without them, right? So some other set of systems is needed. So we need to think about the sort of international dimensions of migration, and the way that this manifests in other places as well. So we've been talking about not just what's happening in the US, but we can think about what's happening in South America. We can think about what's happening in Europe. We can think about what's happening in Israel, Palestine today. So how do we make this international? And then the deep historical conversations, right? So if we don't do the work to recognize that borders themselves are the products of racial engineering, and that the enforcement of those borders continues to perpetuate that system, if we don't do the work to recognize the ways in which our own criminal and immigration systems were systems of racial migration management, and we don't work to sort of make that visible and show the ways that they continue to do that work, then we are having a very, very superficial conversation that kind of subsides to making tweaks, when in fact we need to reevaluate what undergirds the system as a whole.
Wow. I could not have done a better job, Professor. I am so grateful to all of our panelists for their brilliance, for their candor, for their vision, for their historical lessons, for all of the brilliance that they have shared with us. I'm so grateful to the sponsors of this event, and everyone who contributed to make this event happen. Thank you for the attendees that came to this conversation and stayed all the way through and bearing with us through our technical difficulties. Thank you so much. I am leaving this conversation both incredibly sober about the challenges that our people are facing, but also hopeful. Not because the road ahead is easy or because it is going like this will be solved next year, but because I hear in this panel incredible visions of like Grace mentioned, like the arc of our movement, and talking about the ways in which our movement has grown, in which we have begun to address some of these issues, but in the ways in which Jacinta laid out the real clear ways in which we're learning from the past, and we are targeting using those learnings to fight today, and really grounding our understanding of this moment, both in the history and our analysis and the way that Abraham so brilliantly laid out, and really talking about it as an escalating war, right? So I feel really sober about the challenges that is ahead of us. I am grateful for every one of you that is leading the fight, and happy to be in. I'm honored to be fighting with you. And I want to say thank you all so much for coming. I look forward to continue to be in conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank
Round
you.
of applause, even if it's just me. I don't care. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Take
No
care.
All
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Let me thank everyone for that organized this event, and thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts with you. We have a for-profit problem in this country where we've created perverse profit incentives that have allowed private companies to profit from the pain, the suffering of others. For too long, the private prison industry has systematically disregarded human dignity and completely eroded justice in our society without any accountability. At every step of the process, private prisons and their enablers have made a penny and much more off the backs of everyday people who end up on the wrong side of our criminal justice system. They've created a closed-loop cycle that values the profits over people. They've inserted themselves into every segment of prison experience, from medical care, transportation, detention, and now even restorative services. And they've preyed on detainees, their families, at every step of the way, the vast majority of whom come from communities of color and poor communities. The only way to advance criminal justice reform is to bring the voices and experiences of those that have been disproportionately impacted. Those communities need to be at the forefront of these conversations and recognize the backdoor incentives that these individuals that have been incarcerated must endure. Since 2015, I've introduced the Justice is Not for Sale Act to ban federal, state, and local governments from contracting with private entities and to end the profit incentives that allow terrible conditions to flourish with impunity. I believe the Biden administration took an important first step in issuing executive order on DOJ private prisons, but an executive order can always be reversed by the next administration, as we have coldly seen these previous 4 years. It's past time for Congress to permanently codify legislation like this bill into law and ensure a permanent ban on private for-profit detention centers and prison activities. It's an immoral system, it's a corrupt system, and we have an opportunity to change that. I want to thank you for your efforts to reform this criminal justice system, and that is essential to moving forward and to undoing systemic racism in this country. To my colleagues and constituents, this conversation is important, and your support for it is essential. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thanks for that message from one of our own leaders in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, who has really put a Latinx lens on criminal justice reform. I'm deeply honored this afternoon to be able to lead a dynamic discussion that really stands on the shoulders of so many lives that have been lost at the hands of police abuse, so many lives derailed at the hands of racist policy, and so many lives limited by an unjust legal system. And so for those of us who chose to become lawyers, few remain committed to truth over winning, people over profits, and radical dignity. One that bypasses the fallacy of meritocracy for a larger vision, the opportunity to make our unjust systems fairer. And so with this, I want to thank you, Juan Cartagena, who's going to be joining us as a pillar, not just for the legal community or the Northeast part of this country, But for Chicanas like me from East Los Angeles and Elko, Nevada, for making room at the table and setting an example of courageous leadership. So Juan, really excited to have you here.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for those kind words. And you know, I'm looking forward to amazing things from you. Always have.
Thank you. So I know I only have a short conversation with you, but I think it's going to be worthwhile. And I did a little research.
Okay.
And so, Juan, recently you mentioned how the candidacy of Julian Robinson, the first Black mayor who ran in Jersey City in 1969,
right,
cemented your interest in what you called neighborhood power. And so when I think about the underpinnings of that time, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, an unjust war, sending Black and brown Americans to their deathbeds to further our nation's white settler colonialism across the Asian diaspora, I think about where we are today. The Dreamers movement, the BLM movement, repeated terror in Gaza, and decades-long wars. Again, shipping kids from the barrio off to die. How are you making sense of all of this? And what does it mean for justice?
You know, we can all take the position that nothing has really changed. And it's really unfortunate for, in many respects, that's true. I mean, the police killings that galvanized incredible levels of riots and manifestations and protests and kind of like a response, an organic response to violence, you know, were the bedrock of things I remember when I was a child. And I saw with my own eyes that response. And it was a response to police abuse. So that really hasn't changed. Police use of force that kills people who are unarmed has not effectively changed either. It's a sad commentary on the fact that the legal system protects so many officers who don't have any accountability. And the legal system, of course, protects the prosecutorial discretion that is created that doesn't allow for charges to be brought in an impartial way. And the judicial system protects these individuals too. But Sonia, we cannot lose sight of the fact that within all these decades, there has been amazing opportunities for galvanizing people, for organizing people around truth, and for having that truth talk to power. And we are living now in one of those amazing moments. 2020 was an incredible year for putting front and center some of the issues that we've been talking about in the last 2 days in this convening. And 2020 will be followed up. It will not go away. I think we're stronger than ever to actually have conversations about the entire systems, actually have conversations about dismantling those systems, and actually have conversations about what it means to invest in our communities in different ways and to think outside of every box and every corner so we can get things done.
And I want to thank you for that, because my next question for you is really the genesis of this whole conversation, which is that all too often, Latinos, when we're not being scapegoated for an economic recession or the mediocrity of whiteness, frankly, we're pigeonholed as a single issue community. And so this complicates a more nuanced view of both the policy preferences of diverse Latino communities,
right,
but also this possibility of shared prosperity. And so can you talk about your decision to invest in criminal justice reform as the head of a Latinx-facing national organization?
A lot of it was to address what you just mentioned, Sonia. It's a definite problem when mainstream consciousness pigeonholes all of our issues into the immigrants' rights basket. Truth be told, the plight of our gente who come to this country for work and are enticed and lured to cross that border dangerously to perform the work that business needs and exploitable labor that they represent. And it's the backbone of many of our industries in this country. And while we don't want to admit it, these employers are making, well, we do admit it amongst us, right? But the rest of the country doesn't fully appreciate what it means. But so those things have to change and those things have to be reformed. But this whole notion that, we can be pigeonholed into one box is been a problem. I just found out at this convening yesterday, an incredible panel yesterday on issues regarding private prison and everything else. And Claudio Munoz from Grassroots Leadership talks about in Austin as recently as this year, as her and accompanied by our brother Jorge Reyno at Latino Justice would walk the halls and talk to legislators and their staff in Austin about criminal justice reform. Many times the response was, "Oh, no. We're gonna talk to our Black colleagues about criminal justice reform." In otras palabras, it doesn't affect us. So that still goes on today. What made it pretty clear, though, for me when I got to Latino Justice 10 years ago as the president was several things. One is I had been working on criminal justice, criminal legal reform, litigation, and planning it for a long time. When I finally got to Latino Justice, I was a baby, and I was a child in a candy store. I finally had a bunch of lawyers ready to roll in multiple states, and had ideas about all these lawsuits, and one of them was one of the companion lawsuits to stop and frisk litigation in New York City. However, we go way back. It's not just that issue. It's like, yes, there were opportunities and Latino justice was poised to take them on, but it's also personal, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what we see in our familia. It's what we know is happening to talented individuals and youth who are being ensnared in a program and a process and a system in which the consequences are lifelong. It's what we know about police force. Sonia, is what you know personally in your own family about the loss of life due to unjust, unconstitutional use of police force. And these things are personal. There's no group of people that I can talk to that hasn't had direct connection to this outrageously bad, outrageously punitive, retributive system with all of its damaging consequences. And then the last thing I want to tell you about Latino justice, which kind of make it really fascinating the way we are positioned today compared to where we were in the 1970s when we opened our doors, is in the 1970s when we opened our doors for like a good 6, 7, 8 years, we were advancing major litigation to integrate the NYPD, to stop discriminatory tests from stopping people from getting promoted as sergeants or lieutenants, to creating pathways for African Americans and Latinos to become police officers because A, they were good jobs, B, they were needed, and C, this understated and unstated in the litigation because they didn't rise to the level, is that we had assumed that Black and brown police officers would be better at policing. So those issues are coming full circle to us.
Yeah.
Now we're fighting systems and cultures and police departments at police unions that can care less about what we think is Black and brown better policing or any kind of better policing. They're just digging their feet, digging their heels into this and resisting it every step of the way.
You know, it is personal, and it reminds me of my tío who's Filipino, and the lawsuits of the 1980s to get him to be integrated into the SF fire department. And so we just had a panel as part of this convening on good jobs and the role of organized labor in transformation, recognizing that we're facing this issue of scarcity, which is economic opportunity and resilient communities. But I want to switch gears to another place where we're kind of in a weird and difficult time. And as I was conceiving this question for you, some may argue we've always been in a weird and difficult time for women of color. So I wanted to hear from you to talk about the role of women of color, especially Latinx women, in leading movements.
Right.
And what type of changes need